So today we're going to talk about the nervous system. We're going to start talking about the nervous system. And this particular PowerPoint and lecture will sort of introduce the nervous system, give you the overview and some of the basic information. When we talk about the nervous system, we're talking about all of the neural tissue that you find in the body. And specifically, we're talking about two different kinds of cells. We're talking about neurons and we're talking about neuroglia. Now, when we talk about neurons, we're talking about cells that have a very specific job. Their only job is to send and receive signals. I like to sort of visualize neurons sort of chained to their desk, spending their entire lives doing nothing but sending and receiving emails on their little computers. That is all that they do. They don't do anything else except send and receive signals. The neuroglia, on the other hand, are the support cells and the protection cells for the neurons. They provide the nutrients, they protect the cells from invaders, they carry away waste products. They do everything for the neurons that the neurons can't do for themselves. They do not, in any way, shape, or form, participate in the sending and receiving of the signals. That is the neuron's job and only the neuron's job. When we talk about the nervous system in general, and we talk about the organs associated with the nervous system, we're going to talk about the brain and the spinal cord. We're going to talk about the sensory receptors for all of the sense organs. You've talked about some of these in lab already. The eyes, the ears, the tongue, your olfactory receptors. And we're going to talk about the nerves that are responsible for connecting the nervous system to all of the other systems in the body. So when we're talking about neurons, we want to think about them specifically as the functional unit of the nervous system. And the most common kind of nerve that you're going to find, or common kind of neuron that you're going to find in the body, is the multipolar neuron. It is the most common neuron in the CNS. That would be the central nervous system. It is your typical neuron with a cell body, with the short branching dendrites, and with the long axon. The cell body itself is sort of what you would imagine any normal cell to be. It has a large nucleus with a nucleolus. It has these really dense areas of rough endoplasmic reticulum and ribosomes. And if you'll remember, those are areas of the cell that are responsible for producing proteins. Those areas are referred to as Nissl bodies. The purpose of the Nissl bodies is, as I said, production of proteins within the cell, but they are also the reason that gray matter appears gray. So when you looked at the brain, for instance, and you noted that in the cerebral cortex and in the outer layers of the cerebellum, there were areas that were gray matter. Those were areas that were really dense in rough endoplasmic reticulum and ribosomes, and so they would be highly involved in producing proteins. On one end of your multipolar neuron, you have a bunch of really tiny, short branched structures, sort of like the fingers off the palm of your hand. So if you imagine that the palm of your hand was the cell body, your fingers would then serve as the dendrites, with your arm functioning as the axon. These dendrites are responsible for receiving information. Information flows in a one-way path from the dendrites through the cell body and down the axon in these neurons. The axon itself is a fairly long structure, and its job is to carry the electrical signal, or that action potential that we talked about, to whatever target structure is going to be controlled by that neuron. So for instance, if we wanted to contract a muscle, that target that action potential would go to would be the muscle structure. The axon is all about function. The structure of the axon will determine how it functions, and how fast it functions. So we're going to classify our neurons in one of three functional ways. We're going to classify them as sensory neurons, we're going to classify them as interneurons, or we're going to classify them as motor neurons. So sensory neurons are going to be responsible for monitoring the environment, both internal and external. The visceral sensory neurons are those sensory neurons that are responsible for picking up signals from everything inside of the body and sending that information to the central nervous system. The somatic sensory neurons are responsible for monitoring the external environment and sending all of those signals to the central nervous system for processing. You should know the difference between visceral sensory neurons and somatic sensory neurons. Motor neurons are the opposite of the sensory neurons. Their job is to send signals from the central nervous system to the peripheral effectors through a very specific kind of axon called an efferent fiber. Now, there are two major efferent systems that we're going to talk about in a minute. The first of those is the somatic nervous system, or the SNS. The other is the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. The somatic nervous system, you should immediately connect somatic with skeletal muscle in your brain. If you see the word somatic nervous system, you should immediately think skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system, or the visceral nervous system, is responsible for sending signals out that will tell smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, adipose tissue, all of those tissue types that have functions that are not voluntary are controlled by the autonomic or visceral nervous system. The second one that we skipped for a minute there was the interneurons. The interneurons I skipped because they're less common than the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. Most of them are going to be found in the brain, the spinal cord, and in the autonomic ganglia that exist between sensory and motor neurons. All of the interneurons are responsible for one of two things. Their job is either to distribute sensory information to different areas or to coordinate the motor activity that comes from, that is sent out from the central nervous system in response to some of that sensory information that came in. Most of the interneurons are involved in what we call higher functions, things like memory, planning, learning. As you're sitting here listening to this PowerPoint and watching this PowerPoint, you are using interneurons to help to distribute the information that's coming in and put it in places where it's most useful. For the exam, you should know the three different types of neurons. You should know what their different purposes are, and all of the sort of sub-units within those. Okay, so we're going to talk about myelination for a minute as we continue looking at sort of structural differences and functional differences between neurons. Myelination basically serves as an insulation for your neurons. So if you imagine the charger cord for your cell phone or your laptop, inside of that cord are electrical wires. Those would serve as the nerves or the neurons, the axons in this particular example. And the plastic coating that surrounds that covers those and insulates them and protects them and allows the signal to travel a little bit faster, that plastic coating would be the myelination. Now, in areas where you have white matter, so in the arbor vitae and the cerebellum, the deep areas of the cerebrum, the columns in the spinal cord, you have nerves that are heavily myelinated, as opposed to the gray areas, the gray matter, where those neurons are unmyelinated. So when you look at this picture here, what you have is a close-up picture of some axons of some nerves. And all of the areas that are yellow are myelinated areas, and all of the areas that are blue are areas that lack myelination. Now, each of these areas gets their own special name, and so the yellow areas where we have myelination are referred to as internodes, and the areas in between, like this area right here, is referred to as a node. You can also call them the nodes of Ranvier. These are basically gaps where axons are able to branch off from one another and move in different directions. This is going to come into play when we talk about how fast signals move through different kinds of neurons. So just keep in mind that internodes are areas where there is myelin present on the axon, and nodes are areas where there is not myelin present, and that axons are able to sort of branch and move in different directions from there. Now, you've probably already heard the word ganglia in the lab, and hopefully the TAs described that for you as a mass of neuron cell bodies, as a gang of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system that are surrounded by neuroglia. They're surrounded by particular cells whose job it is to sort of keep them together in one area and protect them. Those ganglia are going to become very, very important down the road as well. When we talk about the neuroglia, those support cells for the neurons, there are really 6 different types of neuroglial cells. 4 of those are types that you will find in the central nervous system, and 2 of those are cells that you will find in the peripheral nervous system. We are going to talk about the 4 types that you find in the central nervous system first. The first of those cells is the ependymal cells. They form a special epithelial layer called an ependyma, and their job is to line the central canal of the spinal cord and the ventricles of the brain. And you saw these cells when you looked at your brain dissections. If you looked inside of the ventricles and you saw that brown sort of almost fuzzy dust bunny-like tissue that was inside of the ventricles. The job of the ependymal cells is to secrete cerebrospinal fluid, to monitor that cerebrospinal fluid, and to circulate it throughout the nervous system. You may remember that the term that we use for the ependymal cells that are found in the ventricles is choroid plexus. That is the tissue that we talked about being responsible for monitoring, secreting, and maintaining cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. The second type of neuroglial cell we're going to talk about are the astrocytes. The astrocytes are responsible for isolating the central nervous system from the circulatory system. It maintains what we refer to as the blood-brain barrier. The goal here is to allow us to protect the brain from any toxins or waste products that happen to be circulating in the brain, and to still be able to get the nutrients, oxygen, etc. into the brain that we need. The third cell that we're going to talk about is the oligodendrocyte. This is the cell that is responsible for myelinating myelinating axons in the central nervous system. The job of the oligodendrocyte is to increase the speed of the action potentials as they travel through these axons. It insulates the axons and it makes those nerves appear white. So when you look at the central nervous system, at the brain and the spinal cord, and you see areas that are white matter, those are myelinated axons, and they are nerves that are basically wrapped up with oligodendrocytes. Microglia is our 4th cell type, and their job is sort of the sanitation worker of the neuroglia. They migrate around in the nervous system, they clean up all of the cellular debris, they pick up waste products, they help to eliminate pathogens. They're basically just the cleanup crew. You should know these 4 different types of cells. You should absolutely be able to tell me that oligodendrocytes are the cells that are responsible for myelination in the central nervous system. You should absolutely be able to tell me that ependymal cells are the cells that form the choroid plexus in the ventricles, and that they are the cells that secrete the cerebrospinal fluid. Moving on to the other two types of neuroglia, these are the two neuroglia that are found in the peripheral nervous system. They are only found in the peripheral nervous system. The four that we just discussed are not found here. These two are not found in the central nervous system. The first of these is the satellite cells, or the amphicytes, and their job is to surround the ganglia. Remember, we talked about ganglia as being gangs or groups of cell bodies that are all in one area, surrounded by neuroglia. The satellite cells are the cells that surround those cell bodies and allow for environmental regulation and protection around those cell bodies. The second cell type is the Schwann cell, and this is the PNS version of the oligodendrocyte. In the peripheral nervous system, myelination is created by the Schwann cells that form a sheath, a myelin sheath, around axons of the peripheral nervous system. The difference between the way that the Schwann cells myelinate and the oligodendrocytes myelinate is about the size of the cell. One Schwann cell is capable of covering one segment of an axon. And so it will take lots and lots of individual Schwann cells to sheath or cover an entire axon, whereas an oligodendrocyte is a larger cell and it is able to actually sheath the entire axon with one cell. The difference here is the number of nodes that you're going to have in between each of the individual cells. In a peripheral nervous system axon, you're going to have lots and lots of individual nodes, spaces where those axons can branch, for instance, and where signals can jump from place to place. Whereas in the peripheral nervous system, you're not going to have a lot of that, making for a faster signal and less branching of the axons. Okay, so we're going to talk about how the nervous system is organized. You should absolutely be able to draw, complete, fill in, or answer any questions related to the organization of the nervous system as it sits right here. A couple of things you want to pay attention to. The central nervous system is this area in the purple box up at the top. The peripheral nervous system is everything that is in this yellow area at the end. And then we have the receptors that are related to half of the nervous system and the effectors that are related to the other half. So the central nervous system is going to be our brain and our spinal cord. And the job of the central nervous system is integration of signals. So it's going to receive information from the sensory division. It's going to send out signals to the motor division. In between there, it's going to take that information that it receives from the sensory division. It's going to process that information, decide whether or not it's important enough to be acted on, and then send out a response through the motor nerves to get whatever done that needs to be done. Now, when we talk about the peripheral nervous system, we're going to break it down into two different major divisions. We're going to break it down into the afferent division, and we're going to break it down into the efferent division. What you can remember here is that the afferent division is the division that allows signals to arrive at the brain. So information will travel from the PNS to the CNS via the afferent division, and the efferent division will allow for signals to exit the brain, where information will travel from the CNS to the PNS. Now the sensory division is relatively simple. The afferent division is relatively simple in that it only deals with the receptors in the body. And there are three main kinds of receptors that you need to know. The first of those is the special sensory receptors. These are the receptors that you're going to find primarily in your head. These are your sense of smell, your sense of taste, your vision, your ability to balance yourself, your auditory receptors. These are all special sensory receptors. You also have visceral sensory receptors that are responsible for monitoring all of the internal organs in your body. These are the receptors that tell you when you need to pee. They tell you when you're hungry. They tell you when you might be nauseous. All of these things are sort of internal organ monitoring. And then the somatic sensory receptors, remember I told you to think somatic equals skeletal muscle. The somatic sensory receptors monitor the skeletal muscles, the joints, and the surface of the skin in order to get all of the information from the external environment into the central nervous system to allow for action. So once these signals are received from the PNS to the CNS, what you will find is that the central nervous system will integrate them, process them, and then send out information via the efferent division. And this is going to go through one of two pathways from the efferent division. We're either going to go out to the somatic nervous system, where we're going to deal with skeletal muscle, or we're going to go out to the autonomic nervous system. Now, autonomic sounds a whole lot like automatic, and so you should think of the autonomic nervous system as dealing with things that are involuntary, that you cannot control. The somatic nervous system simply controls the skeletal muscle. So when we talked for the last week or so about the muscle contraction and the steps of muscle contraction, and the first step of that being the neuron firing, that neuron came from the somatic nervous system and controls all of the skeletal muscles in the body. The autonomic nervous system splits off into two sides of the same coin. One side of that coin, the sympathetic division, manages times of stress. This is your fight or flight division. This is the part of your nervous system that causes the hair on the back of your neck to stand up when you're nervous. It causes your heart rate to increase. It causes you to sweat a little bit. It causes your digestive system to slow down and not function as well during times of stress. The other side of that coin is the parasympathetic nervous system, or the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. This is your peace system. The peace system, or the rest and digest system, is what kicks in when all of the adrenaline is gone and everything is good and you're safe and secure and you're relaxed and you're just kind of chilling out. Your heart rate goes back to normal, you stop sweating as much, your digestive system kicks back in normally, everything is working the way it's supposed to be. You should be able to list, describe, complete, fill in the blanks, all of these pieces of information in the organization of the nervous system. When we talk about the anatomical breakdown of the nervous system in general, we're going to talk about it in two big segments. We've already sort of referred to these once. So the central nervous system consists of the spinal cord and the brain. Its jobs are to collect sensory data from inside of and outside of the body, to send out motor commands to the peripheral organs, and it is responsible for all of the higher functions of the brain. Your intelligence, your memory, your ability to learn, your ability to process and understand emotion. All of those things are controlled by your central nervous system. Everything else takes place in the peripheral nervous system. The delivery of sensory information to the central nervous system via the afferent division, and the delivery of motor commands to the peripheral nervous system from the central nervous system via the efferent division are parts of the peripheral nervous system. The nerves in the peripheral nervous system, often called peripheral nerves, but frequently just abbreviated as nerves, are basically bundles of axons with lots of connective tissues and blood vessels around. And they carry that sensory information and motor commands in the peripheral nervous system. The cranial nerves that you learned about in lab connect directly to the brain. The spinal nerves that you learned about in lab attach directly to the spinal cord. We talked already about the afferent division. Its job is to carry sensory information from the peripheral nervous system receptors to the central nervous system. These receptors are designed to detect any change in stimulus. Anytime that there is a change outside or inside of the body, that signal is sent to the brain, to the central nervous system, to be processed and for determination as to whether or not it is an important enough signal to actually create a response. We have a couple of different kinds of receptors here. We have some neurons and specialized cells that are out in the peripheral nervous system, out in the body, picking up regular signals. And then there are some more complex sense organs that you've already looked at in lab, the eyes and the ears, for instance. The efferent division, and I'm stressing the A and the E because I'm hoping it will help you to remember that A arrives at the brain and E exits the brain. Therefore, A would be sensory and E would be motor. The efferent division carries the motor commands from the CNS to the PNS muscles and glands. The effectors that are in at the end of the efferent division respond to different kinds of signals. These are cells, these are organs, these are structures in the body that are able to carry out tasks given proper instruction. We talked about the somatic nervous system being responsible for controlling voluntary and involuntary, i.e. reflexes of skeletal muscles. We'll talk a little bit more about reflexes later. And then we have the autonomic nervous system, which I told you earlier to think of as automatic, as doing all of the things that are subconscious or involuntary, including control of the smooth muscle cells in the digestive system, in the intestinal tract, and the stomach, as well as some interaction with cardiac muscle, and in determining whether or not glands secrete their particular compounds. Within the autonomic nervous system, we have two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. If you remember, sympathetic is stress and parasympathetic is peace, or you may have heard of the fight or flight system, and you can attach that to the sympathetic division, and then rest and digest to the parasympathetic division. All you need to really remember about these divisions at the moment is that they are really opposite sides of the coin. They counterbalance each other. In order for the sympathetic division to be turned off, the parasympathetic division has to be turned on. The somatic nervous system includes sensory and motor neurons. The sensory neurons are those neurons that allow you to detect all of those external stimuli, touch, pain, temperature, proprioception, which is one of my favorites. For instance, I will say to you that even if you are sitting at your desk right now and you cannot see your feet, you know where they are because of your sense of proprioception. You know where your limbs are in space without even being able to see them. Your ability to see, your ability to hear and taste, your smell, your ability to balance and maintain equilibrium. Those are all sensory neurons that are included in the somatic nervous system. Motor neurons are those neurons that leave the central nervous system, that leave the peripheral nervous system, and go out to control and innervate skeletal muscles. The axon of one single myelinated somatic motor neuron, and remember the myelination in this particular case is going to be caused by Schwann cells because we're in the peripheral nervous system, extends from the central nervous system all the way out to the skeletal muscle fiber it innervates. So when we talked about, for instance, the motor units, that one neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates, that is a single axon from a single myelinated somatic motor neuron attaching to all of the muscle fibers involved in that motor unit. As compared to the somatic nervous system, we have the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is all about input from organs, blood vessels, smooth muscle cells, the nervous system, all of those things that are not under voluntary control. Most autonomic motor pathways are a little bit different than the somatic motor pathways. So remember, we talked about a somatic motor neuron being one single neuron that goes all the way from the spinal cord out to its muscle. Autonomic motor pathways actually consist of two different motor neurons that are connected to each other. The first is a neuron that we refer to as the preganglionic neuron. This is obviously a neuron that's going to have its own cell body that's going to be in the central nervous system. And the axon from that neuron is going to extend all the way out to an autonomic ganglion. For instance, you all looked at the sympathetic chain ganglia in lab, and we'll talk about those more in lecture when we return. The second half of the autonomic motor pathway is what we refer to as the postganglionic neuron. It is an unmyelinated axon, and it goes all the way from that ganglia out to whatever effector we are trying to control, whether that be smooth muscle in the digestive system, cardiac muscle in the heart, or a gland somewhere in the integumentary system. The sympathetic nervous system we've already talked about is referred to as the fight or flight system. The stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system is going to lead to increased alertness and an increase in metabolism to allow you to be prepared to either fight or flee. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is your rest and digest division, and its stimulation will slow down most of the activity in your body and allow for a low expensive energy in times of peace and relaxation. This is a table, I'm not sure if this is from your book or if it's from a different book, but it's a really nice table that sort of outlines the differences between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system for you, and I would encourage you to take a close look at this. All right, so when we talk about sensation and we talk about our receptors, we're going to be talking about both the conscious sensation and the subconscious awareness of any changes that take place both externally to the body and internally to the body. The perception is the actual conscious interpretation of that sensation. So there's two different things happening. There is the sensation itself, which you may or may not ever be aware of. And then there's the perception of that sensation. And the perception takes place primarily in the cerebral cortex. So if you remember when you looked at the brain, the cerebrum is the largest portion of the brain, and the cortex is that thin outer layer around the outside of it that is made up primarily of gray matter. That is where perception takes place. You are not necessarily aware of every sensation that your body is picking up. For instance, at some point, and this will stop the minute I say this, but at some point you stop being aware of the clothes touching your body until, of course, you start to think about it. But that sensation goes away because your brain no longer needs to maintain the perception of it because it's realized that it's something that is not necessarily important. Each type of sensation is called a sensory modality, and these sensory modalities will include things like touch, pain, vision, and hearing. They're grouped into either the general senses or the special senses. The special senses are the ones that are primarily connected to the nerves in your head. So special senses would include the big things like smell, taste, vision, hearing, and equilibrium. Those things that really sort of keep you alive and functioning. Losing any one of those senses creates a significant issue for the body, and it has to come up with ways to adapt and overcome. The general senses, on the other hand, are more somatic in terms of your ability to touch, your ability to detect changes in temperature, your proprioceptive ability, like we talked about earlier, And then you have some visceral senses as well that detect things like pressure, chemicals, stretch receptors. They tell you when you're nauseous, they tell you when you're hungry, and they tell you if you have an internal change in temperature, for instance, if you have a fever. The different types of sensory receptors are involved in the different types of senses. So each receptor can be grouped based on its location and based on the original stimulus that activates it. So if I'm talking about location, I'm talking about things like exteroreceptors, interoreceptors, and proprioreceptors. So your exteroreceptors are going to monitor the external environment, your hearing, your vision, your smell, your taste, your touch, your ability to detect pressure and vibration and pain are all things that come from external to the body, primarily, and they are monitored by the set of receptors that we refer to as exteroreceptors. The internal environment of the body is monitored by the interoreceptors. The proprioreceptors are a unique group that help you maintain an idea of body position. It's the reason that you're able to walk around a corner and not walk into the corner without actually watching the corner. It's the reason that you can sit in a chair without having to look behind you to see where the chair is. Your body position, your muscle length and tension, the position and movements of the joints, all of those things are controlled by proprioceptors. Somatic sensations. So remember, we're talking somatic. We must be talking about things that are related to the skeletal muscle and the skin. We're going to include things like tactile receptors, thermal receptors, pain receptors, and proprioceptive receptors. Tactile sensations include things like touch, pressure, vibration, when you have an itch, when someone tickles you. All of those things are tactile sensations that are picked up through tactile receptors. In terms of pain receptors, they come in two forms. Pain receptors are either fast pain receptors or slow pain receptors. Fast pain receptors are going to pick up acute, sharp, or pricking sensations that you perceive within 1/10 of a second. These are really fast. Slow pain receptors tend to pick up things like chronic pain, burning pains, aching or throbbing. So for instance, when you've worked really hard and you start to feel that slow burn in your muscle, those are going to be sent to the nervous system via slow pain receptors. And it can take up to a second or more after the stimulus has reached the nerve before it is actually sent to the central nervous system. Superficial somatic pain is pain that comes from the skin receptors. Deep somatic pain is pain that you're going to get from within the skeletal muscles, from the joints themselves, from tendons and fascia. So if, for instance, you've ever experienced joint pain or a sprained ankle, those are going to come in, those are going to be referred to as deep somatic pain. And then visceral pain is going to be the stimulation of pain receptors in the visceral organs. So when you have a stomach ache, it usually presents in or just deep to the skin that overlies whatever the stimulated organ is. So when you have a stomach ache, you feel that just deep to the skin that is over top of your stomach. Proprioception, as I said, is the recognizing the position of your body parts. This is one of my favorite sensations when you think about it because it's really unique in terms of how it functions. These proprioceptors exist in muscles and tendons, and they come in two forms. They come in the form of muscle spindles, and they come in the form of tendon organs. Muscle spindles are actually found in skeletal muscles, and their job is to monitor the length of the muscle itself. They are involved in things like stretch reflexes that we're going to talk about later. and they help the body to sort of monitor what the body is doing. Tendon organs exist at the junction between a tendon and a muscle, and it allows for protection of the muscle and the tendon to protect it from overstretching. It keeps you from hyperextending or overextending those tendons and muscles and creating a tear. Inside and around the joint capsule of the special synovial joints that we talked about, we have something called a joint kinesthetic receptor. These receptors are responsible for looking for pressure and acceleration and deceleration during movement. The joint ligaments around these joints contain special receptors that protect them against excessive amounts of strain, so that if you are, for instance, running and you come to a rapid stop, your joints can respond to that rapid stop without leading to excessive damage in the body. The somatic motor pathways come from the cerebellum primarily, and the cerebellum does 4 primary activities. Its job is to monitor the intention for movement. So when you think about moving, the cerebellum kicks in and works to monitor those intentions to help figure out what's going to happen. It's responsible for monitoring actual movement. So once you've actually started to move, it helps to maintain balance and helps you to make sure that you're moving in the safest way possible. It compares the command signals that are coming out of the nervous system with the sensory information that's coming into the nervous system, and then it sends out any corrective feedback. So for instance, if you were getting a command signal to run straight ahead, and there is sensory information coming in that says that there's something in your pathway, the cerebellum will then send out that corrective information to help reroute your path so that you don't run into anything. The cerebrum is responsible for integrating a few different things. The first of those is the integration of wakefulness and sleep. And it relies on a very particular system called the reticular activating system. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of the details of the reticular activating system. So for now, what you need to know is that the reticular activating system is what is responsible for determining when you're awake and when you're asleep. And then you have learning and memory, which is also processed in the cerebrum, which includes both your immediate memory, your short-term memory, and your long-term memory. So as I've said before, when you're sitting in class or as you're listening to this lecture, you are picking up information. It's going to your immediate memory. Some of it will move on to your short-term memory. And in order to get it to stay in your long-term memory, you need to spend more time with that information. We're going to end the introduction to the nervous system here. When we return to lecture, we will talk in more detail about some of the functions of the nervous system, some of the functions of the spinal cord and the nerves, and some of the really interesting information related to electrical signals.